1776. The British colonies in eastern North America were divided between the dream of freedom and loyalty to a distant king. Amid this conflict, a document was drawn up that changed everything. What began as a rebellion became a revolution.
Every soldier who picks up a musket, every member of the family back home who is keeping the farm going, is in effect signing their own Declaration of Independence.
Eyewitness accounts and pension applications offer a rare insight into the lives of those who fought for freedom.
Black Americans like Prince Griswold are caught between the cruel reality of slavery and the high-minded rhetoric of liberty and freedom.
Susanna Chandler learns the British Army is coming. She hides her children, and then she watches what happens.
Deborah Sampson takes the name Robert Shirtliff, and she is a model soldier.
Some fought for a higher cause. Others did so because they had no choice. And still others didn't just fight for the freedom of the colonies, but also for their own. To some, they were traitors. To others, revolutionaries. Spring 1775. In Massachusetts, discontent with the British crown was simmering. Britain viewed the colony as a hotbed of unrest on the brink of revolt. The air was heavy with the scent of rebellion. In the 18th century, Britain was on the way to becoming one of the greatest colonial powers in history. Until the mid-18th century, the British Crown granted the 13 American colonies a high degree of self-government. Direct intervention was rare. But the many bloody wars that shored up this colonial power were a massive drain on cash and resources, and those costs were spiraling.
And then all of a sudden, Parliament says, no, we're changing the rules. We need money, we're gonna tax you.
The taxes were on every product imaginable. Day-to-day products like glass and paper and playing cards, even on their favorite beverage, tea.
It's not that they're necessarily unwilling to pay taxes, but as most people know, they don't have representation in Parliament in England. Of course, everybody knows the famous phrase, no taxation without representation.
The anger over the taxes motivates the colonists to start to organize.
And as British soldiers patrolled the streets, rumors of a rebellion spread from Boston to Charleston. In Massachusetts, John Hancock and Samuel Adams formed a clandestine administration. Rebellious colonists everywhere began hoarding weapons and ammunition. In later pension applications, veterans described the tense atmosphere.
In the year 1774, the British troops were in Boston and their fleet lying off and blocking the harbor. Excitement was high, and the moments of actual hostilities constantly anticipated by the inhabitants.
In the sleepy town of Dunstable, William French could never have guessed that the conflict he was about to enter would change his life forever.
William French is a young man in his early 20s. His family has been in this country since the 1500s. His father died when he was a little boy. He was raised by his mother, who was just a teenager. And he signs up for his town militia in 1775 on the eve of the Revolution.
The colonies didn't have an army, only civilian militias. Many of them used to fight alongside the British. Former allies were now on opposing sides. The youngest and strongest fighters made up the rapid response force known as the Minutemen.
On his pension application, William French lists himself as a Minuteman. These are farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters who, when the enemy's at hand, simply grabs a musket, grabs some powder, a few musket balls, and is on the field of battle in a minute.
April 1775. Tensions between the colonists and the Crown were escalating.
General Thomas Gage, the British commander in charge of the colonies, is under pressure to do something. So in the evening of April 18th, 1775, a British force of 1,500 men marches under cover of darkness to Lexington and Concord. In Lexington, they want to arrest the leaders of the Sons of Liberty and their revolutionary fervor, Sam Adams, John Hancock.
The colonists had been stockpiling weapons and supplies in Concord, and Gage was out to destroy those secret stores. He aimed to nip the rebellion in the bud, averting a full-scale revolution. But
the Americans in Boston have got an extensive intelligence network. Gage has a very tough time keeping his plans secret.
the colonists agreed on a secret signal.
They'll hang one lantern in the steeple of the Old North Church if the British decide to march out of Boston down the Shawmut Peninsula. 2 lanterns if they decide to cross by boat and land on the north shore of the Charles River. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea.
Seeing 2 lanterns, Paul Revere and other men set off on horseback to warn the militias. An exhausted messenger arrived at William French's village with grim news. The British were marching towards the munitions depot in nearby Concord. Church bells summoned the Minutemen, among them William French.
William French ventures off into what he doesn't know. He's never been in combat before. Probably, like most other young folks, he's never been very far away from his home.
When William French says goodbye to his mother that morning, he expects to be gone for a couple of days, to have an adventure with his friends from the town, and to walk back to his hometown very soon.
He is not thinking this is the beginning of a war.
When French entered Concord that afternoon, he witnessed the horrors of war firsthand.
Burning military supplies, panicked people. Perhaps he sees some of the dead lying on the ground. He's being introduced to war in one of the most dramatic ways possible.
Williams's company learned that the militia prevented British troops from capturing the arms depot and forced them to retreat. Unexpected news. The fighters continued to Lexington, where the full extent of the British defeat became apparent. Over 270 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, and the militias had driven the British all the way back to Boston.
For the colonists, this conflict is off to a surprisingly good start. But this decisive victory doesn't mean that French and his comrades get to go home. Instead, they're sent to Boston. They're joined by hundreds and then thousands of volunteers from neighboring colonies like New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. French doesn't know it yet, but the American Revolution has just begun.
The militias laid siege to British troops in Boston. Meanwhile, political delegates from all 13 colonies rushed to Philadelphia.
The Second Continental Congress arrives in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. Blood has been shed. And they've kind of got 2 options: to declare independence or to back down. Instead of choosing either, the Second Continental Congress kind of hedges.
This Congress, a convention of delegates from the 13 colonies, signed 2 contradictory documents. One justified the armed self-defense of Concord and Lexington. The other reaffirmed the colony's loyalty to the king.
It says, let's negotiate, let's do something, let's compromise so that this doesn't go any further.
Neither of these documents mentions the important word independence. And King George is not interested in the olive branch petition whatsoever. In fact, he refuses to even read it.
He says, you're in rebellion. He's the one who declared the war, not the Americans. The Americans are still saying, let's see if we can avoid war.
To many people on both sides of the Atlantic, the monarch's arguments sounded plausible. Kings and queens have always ruled. To question their authority was seen as radical, even immoral. That's why only about half the colonists supported the rebellion.
It's important to remember that not only for every member of the Continental Congress, but for every soldier and militiaman who picks up arms, in the eyes of the British, they're committing treason. This is punishable by death. They could be hanged.
King George III's response left the Congress with only two options: full submission to the crown or open rebellion. But delegates still shied away from option 2. In June 1775, delegates voted to establish a joint continental army, a unified military force for all the colonies. One of its aims, to assume control of regiments stationed around Boston. The Army's commander-in-chief was a 43-year-old plantation owner from Virginia, George Washington.
Washington has a remarkable reputation. He's stoic, he's honorable, he's calm under fire. Washington is one of the few men who's actually served in combat. He's led men in combat. On the other hand, it's been over a decade, and he's never led an army larger than about 1,000 men. Now he's going to lead thousands and thousands against the world's most powerful military.
George Washington prepared to assume command. Meanwhile, the British were reinforcing Boston by sea. General Gage planned to occupy the strategically important high ground surrounding the town. Otherwise, his troops would be exposed to colonists' fire. But the colonists got wind of this, and overnight, around 1,000 men headed to Charleston to defend Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. For William French, Bunker Hill was a family affair.
French's family is well represented at the coming battle. His 18-year-old brother Jonas and cousins are there with him.
The British launched their attack with a naval bombardment. For 2 hours, colonial positions were pounded with heavy artillery. For French, a first taste of full-scale battle action. As the shelling ended, Gage prepared his infantry for a frontal assault. Around 3,000 British soldiers faced 1,000 to 2,000 farmers turned colonial militiamen, until then unproven in battle. A test of conviction for young William French.
As the Americans are holding their positions on Breed's Hill, better known as Bunker Hill, the command goes out. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. That's meant to tell the soldiers to hold their fire until the British are close enough that you won't miss when you fire.
French's captain later described to his grandson the devastating effect of the first volley.
Our first fire was shockingly fatal. The enemy was thrown into confusion. Their lines were broken, and it was some minutes before they had conveyed their dead and wounded into the rear.
But the battle had only just begun. The colonists successfully repelled 2 British attacks, but they were exhausted and running out of ammunition. In their third assault, the British broke through the colonists' lines. French and his comrades were forced to retreat.
Dunstable town history records that William French was a hero at Breed's Hill. He was one of the last soldiers to flee the scene of the fighting, and he even helped a wounded officer escape from the British Army. But it was not without cost. Cousin Samuel was shot through the ear in the fighting, but Cousin Eleazar loses an arm. It's blown off by a cannonball at Breed's Hill.
At the Battle of Bunker Hill, some 115 Americans were killed and over 300 wounded, missing, or taken prisoner. British losses were higher, more than 1,000 men.
This is shocking the British. They are expecting to run the Americans off. Instead, the British are finding the Americans are willing to fight. The Americans find, hey, we can stand up against the British.
British losses were so severe, they abandoned all further plans to break out of Boston. They settled in for a siege. But Bunker Hill had claimed one more victim. London had lost faith in Commander-in-Chief Thomas Gage and replaced him with William Howe.
William Howe comes from an aristocratic family. His elder brother Richard is an admiral in the Royal Navy. Howe has extensive experience fighting in North America. As a tactician, William Howe is one of the best the British Army has.
Howe understood the colonists' dilemma, but he was an officer of the king.
A great irony of General Howe is he is kind of pro-American. He is supportive of the colonists. However, he is a British officer in command who took an oath to the crown, so despite his personal views, he's going to support the British cause and put down the revolution.
Meanwhile, George Washington arrived in Boston to inspect his new army.
By Washington standards, these militiamen from New England are slovenly, they are undisciplined. He's not terribly impressed by them. He's also got to face the fact that there's no logistical system, and so Washington is now desperately looking for supplies, ammunition, gunpowder, artillery. He needs shoes, he needs uniforms for his soldiers, he needs everything.
And Washington faced an even greater challenge.
French, like most American soldiers enlisted from outside Boston, expect to be going home January 1st, 1776. But the siege of Boston hasn't ended, and the American army still needs soldiers.
Congress has not yet figured out a way to adequately fund the war. So those soldiers outside of Boston in the winter, they're freezing, they're hungry, many have not been paid, and when they are paid, it's a little over $6 a month. Who would re-enlist?
Some were starting to question the sense of it all. They were British subjects going to war against their king. And when the fighting ended, what then? The answer came in the form of a short pamphlet that became one of the most influential texts of the American Revolution, titled Common Sense. Written by the publicist and political writer Thomas Paine and published in January 1776, it set out a case for independence from Britain.
Common sense will tell us that the power which hath endeavored to subdue us is the most improper to defend us. We have every opportunity and every encouragement before us to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again.
Common Sense was rooted in an intellectual movement championing reason, science, and individual freedom.
So Paine here is building on European Enlightenment ideas that have then come to America and been filtered through American lenses. Paine's pamphlet aims to break Americans away from their attachment to Britain and to kingly government. Paine wants Americans to look to the universal rights of man, relying on reason and relying on experience to devise their own government.
Common Sense argued that rebellion wasn't treason, but resistance against tyranny. This resonated with Americans from all walks of life.
People buy it, people read it, people take it to taverns and town squares and read it out loud to people who can't read for themselves.
Washington himself actually has it read to his soldiers to remind them why they're fighting, why they've left their homes, why they're risking death.
They're fighting for a new country, maybe a country that is run by men like them.
Common Sense convinced men like William French to re-enlist, but not to drive the British out of Boston. The colonial forces were too strong for the British to take on directly, yet too weak to capture the city.
Washington has the men, he has the high ground, he has the advantage, but he's missing one thing to complete the siege: artillery.
In March 1776, a transport of cannons captured from the British finally arrived. Washington positioned them on Dorchester Heights and aimed them at Boston.
Imagine the British waking up and they see ringing the hills around the city the artillery now that Washington needs to do the job.
The Continental Army could now force a surrender with artillery fire. Howe had no choice. The very same month, some 11,000 British soldiers set sail from Boston for the nearest safe British port, Halifax.
One can only imagine what French is thinking. In a year, he and his comrades have done the unthinkable. They've defeated the British, at least for now.
George Washington suspected that the British would press on. He predicted they would regroup and attack a new target: New York. Whoever gained control of New York could cut off the rebellious colonies in the north from the more loyal ones in the south. Washington had to reach New York before the British. Less than 3 weeks after the evacuation of Boston, French marched 320 kilometers south with some 19,000 soldiers.
William French joins this war as a militiaman. He participates in the siege of Boston, protecting the capital of his colony. But now, he's being asked as part of the Continental Army to go to a different colony. There's no idea yet of being fellow Americans.
The noble ideals of common sense were one thing. Leaving home and family was quite another.
It's very common for bad writers to say, and the women kept the home fires burning. But in fact, what women did was take over the jobs of their husbands.
When the men of military age leave, women have to run the farms. And women in colonial America worked very hard on the farms. They were an essential part of farming. But on top of their own substantial work and the extra work they had to do, there was also new work required because of the war.
When colonial troops marched through their town, women had to feed and accommodate them. And if the British suddenly turned up at their door, there was nowhere to hide.
The British Army has traveled across the ocean and don't have a supply line that's reliable. They take any crops that have been stored or preserved. They take the crops from the fields. It's like locusts have come through.
This was a war, and for some women, for some towns, the war came to them.
In her application for a war widow's pension, Deborah Brownell described all the hardships she endured.
I do well remember my husband's service during said war. We had small children to provide for and protect, and how we got along with the small means we then had, I am unable how to tell. It seems as though I could not do it again if I were placed back to that period of my life again. Our sufferings were many and great.
The colonists on the home front faced illness, hunger, and displacement, the likes of which they'd never experienced before.
Deborah's experience is so similar to countless women all across the colonies, just trying to get through every day, making sure she and her kids made it through to try surviving again the next day.
When French arrived in New York in April 1776, the political situation was in stark contrast to that of his hometown. New York City had close trade links with Britain, and the large Anglican community felt a strong loyalty towards England and King George III.
The king is not only the king, he's also the head of the Church of England. So he is your king, but also the high priest. So you're not just rebelling against your political leader, you're rebelling against God's representative on earth.
The Continental Army had to proceed with the utmost caution in New York. In 1776, British warships entered New York Bay.
There's panic in New York City, not surprisingly, among civilians and soldiers at the sight of the Armada headed their way. The British start disembarking soldiers in Staten Island. The numbers are so overwhelming that several Patriot militias on the island quickly switch sides.
There will eventually be 32 to 35,000 British and German auxiliaries. French is from Dunstable. He's a shoemaker. He's never seen this many people. 35,000 soldiers. That is now the largest city in British North America.
Under General William Howe, the British set up camp on Staten Island. Britain had the strongest navy in the world and had bolstered its army with tens of thousands of German soldiers.
German princes of varying ranks would hire out their armies to another power.
They are arguably, at the time, the most feared soldiers on earth, and that's what's coming for the Continental Army.
Washington tried to mobilize his men to defend New York. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia.
By 1776, things are much different than they had been a year earlier. Blood has been spilt, American lives have been lost, and ideas now begin to coalesce around notions of independence, something that looked unlikely only a year earlier.
Independence wasn't just a philosophical goal. It had specific practical and political implications.
The Americans understand that to have any chance, they need allies. And France is really the only game in town in terms of the next ally that could potentially take on the British at this point.
But for Louis XVI, the Americans were difficult allies. After all, they were British subjects rebelling against their king. How could he support such a thing? And should France risk going to war with its greatest enemy over an internal revolt?
How is France going to support and fund a country that hasn't even declared its independence?
So in June 1776, a Continental Congress member tabled a motion.
He says that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent colonies. And that's what starts the process.
A committee of 5 men was appointed to draft a statement setting out the grounds for this independence.
They need to put forth a clear argument on why they're challenging Britain, why they want their independence.
Benjamin Franklin and John Adams commissioned Thomas Jefferson to draft the Declaration. Jefferson wrote his first draft in 2 weeks, drawing on Thomas Paine's common sense and the ideals of the Enlightenment. He argued that the Americans not only had the right, but also the duty to break away from a tyrannical king. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The idea of happiness for all is a new one, a revolutionary one, in fact. Normally, people resign themselves to their lot in life. If you're born poor, you'll remain poor, and happiness can only be conceived of in terms of the hereafter, eternal happiness.
Thomas Jefferson references self-evident truths. He references the notion of self-governance for a population. All of that very much comes out of an Enlightenment setting. Without the American Enlightenment, there couldn't be an American Revolution. The two are intermingled in a way that one's not possible without the other.
The committee simplified the language and softened the tone to make the document more appealing to potential allies. They planned to present it to Congress at the end of June. The resulting Declaration of Independence was adopted by Congress on the 4th of July, 1776.
I'm sure most of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence had very shaky hands when they did it. You know, this is not confident that this was going to work.
The stakes are high. In signing the Declaration, the founders are signing their own death warrants. The British see this as treason.
The Declaration was read out to Washington's troops. After more than a year of service and hardship, French finally knew what he was fighting and may well die for: independence. For all the revolutionaries, there was no going back. This was a matter of freedom or death. After the signing of the Declaration, an attack on New York City was now inevitable. In late August, Commander Howe made his first move. He ordered the British to land on Long Island.
Long Island matters because from the heights at Brooklyn, that will enable the British to fire down upon New York, the southern tip of Manhattan.
French and his comrades prepared to defend Long Island, with fewer than half the troops Howe had at his disposal. In the early hours of August 27th, 2 British columns attacked the colonist positions. With French and his comrades distracted, Howe personally led a detachment through an unguarded pass to the east and caught the revolutionaries off guard on their flank. The ensuing battle was vividly described by Michael Graham from Pennsylvania.
It is impossible for me to describe the confusion and horror of the scene that ensued. Our men running in almost every direction, and the enemy huzzahing when they took prisoners, made it truly a day of distress to the Americans. Every man was intent on his own safety, and no assistance was rendered.
In a bloody and grueling battle, nearly 2,300 Americans were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Almost 7 times as many as the British. The noble ideals of the Declaration of Independence now seemed like a foolish hope.
As it happens, Washington is lucky. A storm brews up, deep fog settles in, and Washington uses the opportunity to extricate his army from Brooklyn.
In mid-September, Howe forced the Americans to retreat further north, where Washington had to ready his men for battle once again. At the end of October, the Americans came under attack from a much larger British force.
Once again, his army is outflanked. Now, normally, this is where armies are destroyed, if men run in an unorderly fashion. But Washington, by experience, has become a master of organizing retreats.
Howe expected Washington to withdraw even further north to protect key supply routes.
George Washington is crafty, and what he does is instead of continuing to flee north, he turns and cuts south and races the whole way across New Jersey, thus throwing the British off his scent.
Howe returned to Manhattan, taking nearly 3,000 stranded Continental Army soldiers prisoner.
Now, Howe and the British believe that the revolution is going to last just a few weeks more. So why build prisons? So they come up with an idea. They're going to hawk warships. You take the masts, rudder, steer house off, leaving just the coffin, if you will, and you fill them with prisoners. So floating prison ships.
Thousands of prisoners were crammed into dark, disease-ridden ships.
To the British, these soldiers are not prisoners of war. They are criminals, they're rebels, and would be treated as such.
By the end of the war, more than 8,500 colonists had died in captivity, just as many as on the battlefield. Following the colony's Declaration of Independence, the British began to direct their contempt towards civilians as well. The British became notorious for both looting and acts of violence while marching through American-controlled territory.
They really do operate on the idea that to the victor belong all the spoils. And these young boys who were far away from home and far away from any moral compass that might have been applied went wild.
Years after the war, Susanna Chandler recalled a shocking encounter with British soldiers.
She describes how she hears that the British Army is coming. She seizes her children, she runs to neighboring farmhouses and warns other women. She puts her babies into tobacco barrels. She packs them with straw to muffle the cries. And then she heads into the swamp. And from the swamp, she watches what happens. The British not only steal what she had planned to use to feed her family, they also start to burn the house. It's the kind of story that happened over and over during this war. We can't really understand the American Revolution without knowing stories like that of Susanna Chandler, too.
The mistreatment of prisoners and civilians caused outrage among Americans. Instead of undermining their morale, it had the opposite effect.
Part of what converts a lot of Americans to support the revolution and to support Washington is the behavior of the British Army.
But after its defeat in New York, was there an army left to support? In December, Washington withdrew his depleted troops across the Delaware.
Unfortunately for him, the Germans set up camp just across the river in Trenton on the New Jersey side. The Continental Army is not going to get a good night's sleep knowing that just across the river is this powerful army.
Of the original 19,000 colonists, more than 2/3 had been killed or taken prisoner. The rest had deserted or died of disease. From the perspective of both the British and the rebellious colonies, the war looked to be drawing to a close. But Washington was aware of an even bigger problem. Just as it had been a year earlier, the soldiers' term of service was due to end on the 1st of January, 1777.
Unless Washington can do something bold and decisive to turn the war around, his army's going to simply resign.
After almost 2 years, French faced a hard decision.
French's enlistment is up at the end of the year, and he and his comrades are going to have to decide, do they re-enlist and stick with this cause, or do they go back home to their families, to their businesses, to their farms that need them?
They're getting letters from home. A wife says, "Winter is coming. We have no wood and we will freeze. We have no food and we will starve. Pray come home." And men got these letters and they left. They felt their first obligation was to their family.
Even Washington grappled with a sense of deep melancholy.
So in the heart of this conflict, at the end of 1776, Thomas Paine makes another contribution to the American revolutionary experience. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country.
The influential political writer reminded many that their struggle served a higher purpose.
But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. And these are words that soldiers listen to, and it inspires them to fight through.
But without battlefield success, such words rang hollow. Defying all military logic, Washington decided to go on the offensive and picked a risky target, the Germans on the other side of the Delaware. Washington planned an attack in 3 columns, and on the night of the 25th of December, under cover of darkness, he crossed the icy Delaware River.
A lot of these soldiers, like French, are a week away from mustering out of the army. Do they really want to go on a suicide mission at the last moment?
But over a period of 18 months, French had changed. From part-time volunteer to full-time soldier, he followed orders.
As the Continental Army sets out to cross the Delaware River, the weather takes effect. It's miserable. Cold, snow, sleet, huge cakes of ice floating down the Delaware River.
They need to bring cannons. They need to bring horses in small boats across the river. And everything goes wrong. 2 of the 3 prongs that are supposed to cross the river can't do it. Washington crosses, not knowing that the other 2 prongs are out of the field of combat.
As Washington sets out south, leading his troops on a march to Trenton, he's got a much smaller force than he anticipated. The approach march that French is on, along with his fellow soldiers, is a miserable affair. Many of the soldiers have rawhide around their feet rather than proper shoes. A couple of soldiers die from the effects of the cold. Yet they continue on.
The commander in Trenton is Colonel Rawl. Now, he doesn't believe Washington's going to attack. The weather is horrific. It's in the middle of winter. Moreover, it's Christmas. They're not expecting the attack.
Exploiting the storm conditions, the Americans attacked the German garrison and drove the soldiers back. William Hutchinson described the massacre.
Their dead bodies lay thicker and closer together than I ever beheld sheaves of wheat lying in a field over which the reapers had just passed. Now that's a colorful description.
Some 100 Germans were killed and around 900 taken prisoner. Several hundred escaped. The only American casualties were 2 soldiers who froze to death. In the days that followed, Washington won a series of minor battles.
It cannot be understated just how important it is on American morale. It helps give Americans who are independence-minded the boost that they need.
It basically saves the war. The soldiers re-enlist. Washington's reputation is revived.
Fighters enlisted for the first time or re-enlisted to fight for independence. William French was one of them. Washington could begin rebuilding the Continental Army.
I was urged to stay longer and did continue to do duty in said company a month or 6 weeks longer, and came home in the months of February or March 1777.
After almost 2 years, French returned home. He had experienced hardship, death, and defeat, and fought in some of the toughest and most decisive battles of the early years of the Revolution. For French, the war was over, leaving others to continue the fight. And follow up the latest victories with new ones. A key figure in this new phase was 23-year-old Prince Griswold. Griswold, an African-American, was born into hereditary slavery in Connecticut. His slave owner was Matthew Griswold, the Chief Justice and Deputy Governor of the colony.
Now, we think of the American Revolution as being about freedom, and it is, but that means different things to different people.
Black Americans like Prince really are caught between the cruel reality of slavery and the high-minded rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence with its focus on liberty and freedom.
It's a revolution of brothers who are equal to one another, but who are not necessarily equal to those around them or below them, such as, for example, servants or slaves, or their sisters.
Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration contained an explicit condemnation of George III's role in the slave trade.
He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither. This is an astonishing statement for Jefferson to include in the Declaration of Independence. All of the colonies at this time have slavery. Jefferson himself is a slaveholder. He will be for the rest of his life.
The South Carolina delegation at the Second Continental Congress says that line can't stay, says the Declaration of Independence cannot have a claim that the slave trade is wrong.
Nevertheless, the revolution presented new opportunities to enslaved people, at the same time forcing them to make difficult choices. Choices that differed significantly between the North and the South. In the southern colonies, where economies were heavily reliant on slave labor, British military leaders offered enslaved people the prospect of freedom if they escaped to join British lines and supported the cause of George III.
Now, that offer is not done really kind of out of the goodness of their hearts. It's really very specifically done to swell the ranks of the British Army and to undermine the American colonies, to have enslaved populations on these plantations leave.
What they're trying to do is disrupt the Southern economic system built on slavery in hopes that this will drive the planters to make peace.
In huge numbers, enslaved men, women, carrying their children, find the British Army.
And those who do risk their life, leaving the plantation and in some cases, walking miles and miles and miles so they can get to the British Army, where they are greeted not as loyal Britons, they're greeted as laborers.
Although slavery was still legal in the North, it was less widespread there. Free black militiamen were fighting on the American side. However, the leaders of the revolution were initially reluctant to enlist black men into the Continental Army.
The revolution is being fought over all this rhetoric of freedom, this rhetoric of liberty, and so the optics don't look particularly good when you're enlisting enslaved people to fight for your white liberty.
But the heavy losses suffered in 1776 forced Congress members to reconsider.
They need more soldiers. And so some of the northern colonies, like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, produced these limited pathways to freedom for enslaved people who were willing to sort of swell the ranks of the Continental Army.
Around 1777, Connecticut passed a law. White patriots could send enslaved men to the military in their place in exchange for the slaves' emancipation.
This appears to be the case for Prince, but Prince is not alone. He has a brother, Jim, who enlists as well.
Prince Griswold's freedom came at a high price. His term of service was extended to 3 years, and he might have joined the losing side.
The Founding Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence, but Prince, in enlisting to fight, is in effect signing his own Declaration of Independence. So for someone like Prince, the revolution is literally a choice between liberty and death.
Just a few weeks after being called up, Griswold was sent off to fight. Washington had learned that William Howe had landed his army at the northernmost point of Chesapeake Bay. If Washington failed to stop Howe there, the British would have a clear route to Philadelphia, where they could deal a fatal blow to the revolution in its capital.
The 11th of September, 1777 is humid and foggy. Under these conditions, the British Army sets out to attack Washington.
Washington stationed his forces along Brandywine Creek, about 40 kilometers west of Philadelphia. There, Griswold found himself in the largest battle of the entire war, some 14,000 colonists against around 16,000 British troops. When Washington saw the British advancing, he expected a frontal attack from Howe.
During the fight, though, he gradually learns that there are British forces to his north. It's at that moment that Washington realizes he's being outflanked.
Prince Griswold and his comrades were ordered to reinforce the right flank. They held their position as the Continental Army withdrew. After 11 hours, American casualties were twice as high as those on the British side. The only way to avert disaster was organized retreat.
Howe was hoping to destroy the American army at Brandywine. Instead, all he's done is bloody it.
Prince Griswold survived his first battle.
The pension applications tell us a lot about these soldiers. In the case of Prince, you have white soldiers that served with him that testified that he was a good soldier. And one of the things that was brought up was he always carried a fiddle with him. And this is not to be understated. Someone that could play the fiddle could bring some much-needed entertainment to the drudgery of camp life.
Washington faced an agonizing decision: to defend Philadelphia and risk defeat, or abandon the city.
Washington does the right thing by allowing the British to take Philadelphia and lives to fight another day.
In late September 1777, William Howe entered Philadelphia. The capital had fallen, Congress members had fled. More than ever before, victory for the Revolution seemed a distant prospect. Washington now badly needed a win, for the men in Congress to prove that he was the right man for the job, and for France to show that supporting the Americans was a worthwhile project. France had been secretly sending cash and weapons to the colonies since 1775. Not out of revolutionary fervor, but to weaken its archenemy England. The French also sent volunteers like 19-year-old Gilbert de Moutier, the Marquis de Lafayette, who arrived in America in 1777, full of idealism and a thirst for adventure.
He becomes quite close to people like Washington, Hamilton, the people that are kind of leading the revolution. They know that he is a potentially very important ally in convincing the right people in the French court to whisper in the ear of Louis XVI.
But for France to declare war on Britain, something Paris had been wanting for some time, George Washington needed a victory. When Howe divided his forces between Philadelphia and nearby Germantown, Washington seized his chance. In early October 1977, his men prepared to face Howe's elite units. The attack was set for 5 a.m., but once again, thick fog rolled in. Washington's carefully planned offensive began to fall apart.
In the fog, two American units come into contact. Neither one realizes that the other one is American. A friendly fire incident ensues. American casualties are produced by American soldiers.
The attack lost momentum. The British gained the upper hand. The regiment retreated under fire.
Germantown isn't the success that Washington is hoping for, but it impresses the French observers who are with the army. They see an army that is willing to stand and fight.
But Germantown alone wasn't enough to persuade the French to enter the war. A second front proved more helpful in this regard. Fighting was also taking place far to the north of Pennsylvania, near Saratoga. The American General Horatio Gates was engaged in a series of battles against British forces invading from Canada.
The British General Burgoyne, known as Gentleman Johnny, his army is trapped at Saratoga. The Americans then seize on that opportunity.
In two battles fought 3 weeks apart, Gates's troops killed or captured almost all Burgoyne's soldiers.
This is a devastating defeat for the British and an enormous victory for the Americans, and one of the most consequential moments of the entire war. It convinces the French to join the cause.
But it would be months before any troops and funding arrived from Paris. The onset of winter also ended the campaign for the year 1777.
Armies typically didn't fight in the winter. It was too difficult. It seems silly to us today, but they'd basically say, time out, we'll see you in the spring.
Washington and his men set up winter quarters at Valley Forge, a day's march from Philadelphia. Prince Griswold was among them. Work to build the camp began immediately upon arrival.
With so many men building so many cabins there, Valley Forge becomes what would be the fourth largest city in the country at the time.
The onset of winter caused a dramatic decline in living conditions. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Most of the soldiers were ill-equipped for the extreme cold. Up to a third had no shoes. Blankets were in short supply, and food was running out.
Soldiers are going many days without eating, often resorting to eating things like tree bark or their shoe leather. The situation at Valley Forge is growing desperate.
People often say that money is the key to wartime success, but they forget that food is essential for victory. If your army starves, you lose.
Even more dangerous than the cold and hunger was disease. Smallpox and other epidemics spread rapidly in the cramped conditions.
Smallpox is incredibly debilitating. It causes a number of symptoms, things like headache, fever, rash, body pains, causes death in about 30% of cases, so it's a very serious disease.
Smallpox claimed the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians during the war. Estimates indicate Washington's army lost more troops to disease than to fighting.
The thing about smallpox is that once you've had it, typically you are immune from that point on. British soldiers typically have a greater immunity to smallpox, as smallpox had spread more widely in Europe.
Motivated by the scientific ideals of the Enlightenment, European doctors sought ways to combat the disease.
Enlightenment-era medicine made some progress with scarification and inoculation, and that saved the Continental Army.
Inoculation is done by making an incision on the person who's being inoculated, at which point pus or scabs from a person who has smallpox would be inserted into that wound, with the idea being that the person would contract hopefully a mild form of smallpox, which they would recover from relatively quickly and then be immune to smallpox from that point on.
The practice was controversial, but from 1777, Washington ordered the systematic inoculation of all troops. The infection rate sank as a result.
At a time when epidemics were claiming more lives than battles, it was a stroke of genius to inoculate American troops.
Nevertheless, an estimated 2,000 soldiers died in the 6 months in Valley Forge. When spring finally arrived, the troops regrouped. The nearly 400 women in the camp played a key role.
In both the British Army and the Continental Army, there are women who travel with the men in the army.
For a long time, the assumption was they were prostitutes, but that wasn't the case. These women were often wives with children following their husbands.
Some of the women with armies are there because their own homes have been destroyed, or there's no way to feed themselves at home. They're not in a great position, but the army provides them at least a little bit of security.
The women are gathering firewood and nursing the sick, and they're doing the laundry. And they're not just doing the laundry for their husbands. They're doing laundry for the whole regiment. And so ultimately, they are a vital part of these military encampments.
Some of the women in the camp also participated in battle, disguised in men's clothing.
We don't really know how many women enlist, because if they get away with it, then they'll be recorded in the Army records by a male name.
But anyone caught doing so risked public humiliation.
They treat her like she's a whore, and they march her out of the military setting, stripped to the waist, behind a cart with her hands tied, and the fife and drum corps are playing what came to be known as the Whore's March.
But Deborah Sampson enlisted anyway.
Deborah Sampson is a Massachusetts woman from a very poor family. She's a domestic servant, and she's going to be a servant all of her life. She would never have a dowry, so it's a gloomy prospect.
The Army pay offered the prospect of a better life.
The recruiters come through town for the Continental Army, and she joins up. Now, women aren't supposed to join up, right? So she has to disguise herself as a man.
She takes the name Robert Shirtliff. She's tall, and she has the appearance of manliness when she cuts her hair and puts on a uniform. As far as we can tell, she's one of the guys. She goes to the tavern, she's drinking with the other soldiers, she's flirting with the barmaids, and I don't think anybody challenged her.
Deborah Sampson symbolized the new opportunities presented by revolutionary ideas.
One of the things with ideas is that it's very hard to control how they flow. In this context of the American Revolution, American women start to think freedom and liberty sound like good ideas to us.
3 months before the Declaration of Independence, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, Congressman John Adams.
I long to hear that you have declared an independency. I desire that you would remember the ladies. If particular care and attention is not paid, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
But just as with slavery, women's rights were not explicitly mentioned in the Declaration.
Stating the fact that all men are created equal is itself at the time a radical position. This is a world in which all men are not considered equal. But we need to see that the Founding Fathers could have pushed this thing further than they did.
What the revolutionary ideal of freedom would mean for women and slaves remained an open question at the time. Washington began drilling his troops at Valley Forge with the help of Prussian officer Friedrich Wilhelm August von Steuben.
Von Steuben shows the Army how to fight with bayonets, how to resist a bayonet charge. The soldiers see themselves coming together. They're learning new tactics. So when the Army marches out of Valley Forge, they are a European-style fighting force.
As Washington prepared for the next clash in the summer of 1778, he did so with the assurance of French support. But he also had a new adversary.
General Howe has had a number of remarkable successes against George Washington, but he hasn't delivered the decisive victory yet. And the British cannot understand, the king, the parliament, how is Howe not ending this war? And their patience has grown thin. Yet another British commander is sent over to try to win this war.
Sir Henry Clinton was a highly respected strategist and tactician. He realized that the French entry into the conflict had put it on a new tack. To avoid being caught between Washington's army and the French Navy, he decided to abandon Philadelphia and march on New York. In June 1778, the Continental Congress returned to the de facto capital. Washington followed Clinton's troops into New Jersey. The large British army was spread out over a 19-kilometer-long column. When an opportunity arose, one of Washington's generals, Charles Lee, ordered an attack on the British rear guard. Clinton then dispatched his deputy to confront the Americans. He hoped to provoke a major battle.
Lee encounters the British army and sees that he's up against a bigger force than he'd reckoned.
Charles Lee cuts and runs, doesn't follow Washington's orders, and almost risks the entire army in a rout at Monmouth.
Washington arrived to find his newly trained army on the brink of collapse. He directed his fury at Charles Lee.
George Washington was known for his stoic demeanor. In truth, he had a volcanic temper. Well, that temper came out at Monmouth. It was said by the soldiers that Washington was so volcanically explosive that the leaves on the trees nearby quaked when he chewed out Lee and removed him from command.
Although the colonists were outnumbered, thanks to von Steuben's training, they were no longer the mob previously mocked by the British. Now they put up fierce resistance.
What seems like a disaster for Washington actually turns into a pretty good day. Eventually, the fight becomes a stalemate, both sides exchanging artillery fire, musketry. Washington holds the battlefield at the end of the day. His army did not have to fall back. It held the ground.
The soldier Joseph Martin told the story of a woman who worked alongside men in the artillery.
Martin recounts that while helping her husband reload an artillery piece, an enemy cannonball passed right between her legs, tearing away the lower part of her dress. He writes, "Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for in that case, it might have carried away something else."
After the battle, the men nicknamed the woman Molly Pitcher.
Molly was a common nickname for Mary, so we believe it might have been Mary Ludwig Hayes. She gained a lot of fame and is an iconic part of the Revolution.
The fighting at Monmouth went on for 12 hours. For Prince Griswold, this was the final battle.
Prince is shot in the leg. He's one of an estimated at least 25,000 Revolutionary War soldiers who are wounded or disabled from the fight.
Griswold was one of an estimated 5,000 African-American men who fought in the war. He was honorably discharged from service in August 1780. He returned to Connecticut as a free man, yet his great achievement was overshadowed by loss and grief.
Prince learns that his brother Jim is killed during the war, so for one it is liberty, and for the other it is death.
Following the Battle of Monmouth, British commander Clinton withdrew to New York. Meanwhile, Washington took up positions north of Manhattan. Neither side wanted to do anything rash. British strategy now focused on the southern colonies of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Opinions on the Revolution were much more divided there.
There were far more loyalists in the South because the South was very rural. It was very agrarian. And the prime product, which was based on slavery, was producing things like rice and indigo and cotton and tobacco. And one of the biggest consumers of these products, the British. The British, therefore, realized if they went into the South, they could take advantage of all these loyalists to do the fighting for them.
In December 1778, the British captured the strategically important deep-water port of Savannah. But this operation differed from those in the north.
In many ways, the war in the South becomes a civil war. The two sides are neighbors, sometimes family members. They fight against each other, and so towns are split apart. Individual men sometimes will serve on one side and then later on the other side.
As James Potter Collins wrote in his memoirs,
times began to be troublesome, and people began to divide into parties. Those that had been good friends in times past became enemies. They began to watch each other with jealous eyes.
In 1780, at the age of 17, Collins joined a patriot militia alongside his father and his older brother.
When Collins' father enlists, he says, "We must submit and become slaves or fight." For Collins' family and for many other American revolutionaries at this time, the idea of liberty or death has become much more than just rhetoric. It is really kind of central to their belief system at this point.
The British strategy was beginning to bear fruit in the South. Under Commander-in-Chief Clinton, the British captured Charleston in South Carolina.
Clinton takes Charleston and not only captures the wealthiest city in North America, he also captures some 5,000 American soldiers. He takes the American army off the chessboard in the South.
2 weeks later, Colonel Bannister Tarleton routed remaining American forces at Waxhaws in South Carolina. More than 100 Americans were killed, compared with just 5 British soldiers. This sparked rumors that Tarleton had ordered a massacre of prisoners. It shocked the colonists, and it earned Tarleton a reputation as a bloodthirsty commander.
He did not allow them to surrender. He gave them no quarter, as the expression was. Therefore, a term called Bannister Tarleton's Quarter, or Tarleton Quarter, became popular during the war.
The British offensive in the South appeared unstoppable.
Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, takes command of the Southern Department. Charles Cornwallis faces him in battle at Camden, South Carolina.
A British bayonet charge caused Gates's men to panic and flee. This gave the Redcoats, as they were known, control of South Carolina. Reporting to Clinton, British Commander Cornwallis said that resistance in the South had been crushed, except, he added, for a few scattered militias. But those militias were not giving up.
We were a set of men acting entirely on our own footing without the promise or expectation of any pay. We depended on what chance or kind providence might cast in our way, and we were always ready to decamp in a short time, so that we were what might be called the harum-scarum boys, the ranting squad.
Militiamen like Collins fight a different kind of war. They will strike from hidden locations, trying to hit the British where they're weakest, attacking small outposts, attacking loyalist militia, always trying to keep the British wondering what's next.
In early October 1780, 900 patriots gathered at Kings Mountain in South Carolina for a head-on clash with more than 1,000 loyalist militiamen. Most of those loyalists were killed or taken prisoner, whereas patriotic forces suffered just 90 casualties. Following the Loyalists' surrender, the Patriots took revenge for Tarleton. Dozens of Loyalists were shot and 9 were hanged.
After the fight was over, the situation of the poor Tories appears to be really pitiable. The dead lay in heaps on all sides, while the groans of the wounded were heard in every direction. I could not help turning away from the scene before me with horror, and though exulting in victory, could not refrain from shedding tears.
The Patriots' victory marked a turning point in the South.
The victory at Kings Mountain raises the morale of the Americans. It helps convince, perhaps, some who were wavering that maybe it's a good thing to back the Americans fighting for independence.
The Continental Army and Patriot militias went on the offensive. At the Battle of Cowpens in 1781, they won a resounding victory over British forces, with the British suffering almost 8 times as many casualties as the Americans. 2 months later, at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, American Major General Nathaniel Greene further decimated British forces. Cornwallis was forced to rethink his strategy.
He goes to Yorktown on the coast of Virginia. He expects that the British Navy is going to sail down and either reinforce and resupply him or transport his army back to New York City.
But now that the Americans had the support of the French Navy, Washington saw an opportunity to lure Cornwallis into a trap at Yorktown. In consultation with the French, plans were hatched to block Cornwallis's escape from Yorktown by sea. To throw British Commander Clinton off the scent, Washington staged a fake attack on New York.
Washington builds a fake camp. He lights campfires. He has information spread around, knowing that loose lips will sink ships, so to speak.
Meanwhile, under the cover of this deception, he led his troops south. For its part, the French Navy readied itself for a clash with British ships.
The French Navy is deployed. It blockades and intercepts the British Navy, and in a stunning victory, defeats the all-powerful British Navy. Now Cornwallis is trapped.
John Bodie was among the revolutionaries marching toward Yorktown.
John Bodie's story is remarkable. According to his pension application, he enlisted in 1776. He's been with George Washington while crossing the Delaware River. He suffered through Valley Forge. He fought at Brandywine, where he was shot and wounded. By this point, he's in the war for 5 years. He thought he had only signed up for 3 years. Bodie mentions this misunderstanding not once but twice in his pension application, where he says, and this declarant again repeats, at the expiration of that period, 3 years, he was told by his colonel that he had not enlisted for 3 years, but for the war, to which he yielded and accordingly served the United States faithfully.
Although sea escape routes were blocked, the British were still protected by robust fortifications at Yorktown. Washington prepared for a siege.
The French army, when it comes to Yorktown, demonstrates its skill at siege warfare.
The French ordered the nearly 20,000 Allied troops to dig siege trenches based on the European model.
The idea is to bring in your artillery as close as possible in order to fire at the enemy fortifications. It's dirty, dangerous, and exhausting work.
At Yorktown, Cornwallis used a system of small dirt forts and ditches, surrounded by sharpened stakes. These were to provide cover from artillery and prevent any effective use of the enemy's cannons.
Anytime the Continental and French armies try to dig a little closer, they come under withering fire.
Cornwallis hoped to hold off his enemies long enough for reinforcements to arrive, but Washington had a plan up his sleeve.
There's one redoubt number 10, which is on the end. If they can annihilate that redoubt, they can come in through the corner and hit the main British army.
400 men braced to attack the redoubt.
The fire of their muskets will alert the British that this is happening. So in a secretive night attack, they go in with only swords, bayonets, hand-to-hand combat.
John Bodie was a member of that unit.
In his pension application, he writes, George Washington ordered us to storm the breastworks of the enemy, which were galling us very much. And this applicant was in the division under Colonel Hamilton that stormed and took one of those redoubts. And they overrun Redoubt 10, they kill the British, they capture the cannons. In the morning, Cornwallis awakens to see his own cannons aimed down at him.
Cornwallis realized he had run out of options. On October 19, 1781, an officer approached the American camp waving a white handkerchief.
Cornwallis refuses to come out and surrender to Washington. He says that he doesn't deem Washington to be worthy of being on the same battlefield. So he sends a second-in-command out. Washington sends a message back, if Cornwallis comes out and surrenders like a gentleman, I'll give him favorable terms. If he does not, we'll open up the cannons. So Cornwallis is forced tail between his legs, sheepishly, to come out in an embarrassing surrender. And that's it. That's the end.
When the news reached Britain, Prime Minister Frederick North is said to have exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." The American victory at Yorktown led to the collapse of the British government. Under a new prime minister, peace negotiations were opened with the Americans and their French allies. But the battles continued. Deborah Sampson's unit was ambushed near New York by British and Loyalist troops. Sampson was shot twice in the leg. To prevent the discovery of her gender, she extracted one of the bullets with a penknife and sewed up the wound herself. The other bullet remained lodged in her leg, causing her pain for the rest of her life. A year later, Sampson came down with a fever. This time, her true identity was revealed in hospital.
And then an interesting thing happens. They look at her record, and she is a model soldier. And they don't dismiss her in shame. She goes back to Massachusetts. She gets married. And now she's Deborah Sampson Gannett. And when she dies, her husband, Samuel Gannett, applies for a widow's pension, and he gets it.
The American War of Independence was formally concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on the 3rd of September, 1783. This marked Britain's official recognition of the United States of America. The American Revolution brought freedom to many, but not to all.
What really changed for most of the population, apart from paying less tax to the British? If you're not a landowner, you can't vote. If you're a slave, you're still a slave. One might wonder whether Tocqueville's famous remark about revolutions, the more things change, the more they stay the same, might apply to the American War of Independence.
In fact, after the American Revolution, the life of enslaved people in the South became much worse. There was much tighter regulation on their movements because they had proved that if given a chance, they would try to get out of slavery.
Of course, the unfulfilled promises to people of color, to women, to the indigenous population, that would take blood and decades to really fill those purposes.
The revolution led to 2 centuries of struggle to make real the preamble to the Declaration of Independence.
Benjamin Rush, another signer of the Declaration of Independence, says the American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed.
Although they were only partially realized, the ideals of the Declaration, equality, liberty, the right to the pursuit of happiness, and government by the consent of the governed, resonated far beyond the borders of the independent United States of America. In 1789, Thomas Jefferson helped Lafayette draft the first version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The document was directly inspired by the Declaration of Independence and formed one of the ideological foundations of the French Revolution. The desire for independence spread like fire leaping from branch to branch.
You see an entire revolutionary period emerge that is not just concentrated in the United States. Fundamentally, Western civilization is changed.
Events in the U.S. inspired the Haitian Revolution, the Irish Rebellion, and the Colombian War of Independence, as well as many anti-colonial movements.
The legacy of the American Revolution was felt throughout the world and is still an aspirational example to people who want to live free and unencumbered by tyranny.
For those who took part in the war, it was a deeply personal matter. Some fought for lofty ideals, others for their families and neighbors, or for personal freedom, and some simply to survive. Deborah Sampson was the only woman to receive a veteran's pension for her service. William French spent the rest of his life in Dunstable. Prince Griswold changed his surname to Crossley, his mother's maiden name. In 2024, the Connecticut Society of the Sons of the American Revolution honored him with a commemorative plaque. James Potter Collins settled in the state of Texas and died at the age of 81. John Bodie lived in poverty because of his war injuries. In 1834, he was finally granted a pension. 2 years later, he died at the age of 80.